Trump just threw the ultimate tantrum after Emmanuel Macron ripped him apart with cold, hard facts. What started as a routine meeting between the two leaders, who are usually all about smiles and firm handshakes, quickly turned into a showdown. This time, Macron didn't hold back, fact-checking Trump right to his face and leaving him visibly frustrated. And beyond the heated exchange, this moment exposed a deeper rift between the US and Europe over the Russia-Ukraine war, as Trump refused to call Putin the aggressor. So, let's break down what went down and why it matters. Trump furious with Macron. Things got pretty awkward for French President Emmanuel Macron during a G7 video meeting on Monday, 24th of February, which marked the third anniversary of Ukraine's invasion. Donald Trump looked pretty ticked off at Emmanuel Macron because Macron cut him off and challenged Trump's statement that Ukraine started the conflict with Russia. A clip from the meeting was shared with world leaders, showing Macron sitting on the edge of a desk in the Oval Office while Donald Trump took the prime spot in a big, comfy leather chair. Macron, who's 47, looked noticeably uneasy with the setup. Meanwhile, to Trump's left, Vice President J.D. Vance was just chilling, sitting wide-legged with a long red tie hanging below his waist. People couldn't help but notice that when the French president arrived at the White House, it wasn't Trump who greeted him at the West Wing. Instead, the acting White House Chief of Protocol, Abigail Jones, did the honors. But a little later, Trump did step in and welcomed Macron with a firm, drawn-out handshake. That handshake didn't go unnoticed either. Social media users were quick to describe it as a tug-of-war moment, with both leaders holding on for an unusually long time. But things got even more intense when the two leaders started discussing Ukraine. Macron wasn't having it when Trump pushed for Ukraine to hand over $400 billion worth of minerals. They clashed over the demand. Trump, however, sounded confident about a deal happening soon. He said Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky may come to Washington this week or next because the two countries are very close to finalizing an agreement on rare earth minerals. Trump recently called Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator, and that didn't sit well with other Western leaders. They publicly pushed back against him. Trump's frustration with Zelensky comes from a mix of reasons. For starters, the Ukrainian leader is linked to Trump's first impeachment back in late 2019, which isn't exactly something he'd forget. Plus, Trump has always shown more admiration for strongman leaders like Putin or China's Xi Jinping rather than Zelensky. The Ukrainian president has built a reputation for standing his ground and defending his country, aligning himself with Western values. But Trump, he sees the world through a power dynamics lens. It's all about who's in control. When he met Zelensky at Trump Tower in October 2024, he made it clear that, just like in a tango, only one person leads. Zelensky, for his part, wasn't thrilled about being left out of the discussions in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where the US and Russia were holding talks. When Trump made remarks about the situation, Zelensky fired back, saying the former president was stuck in a disinformation space. That comment reportedly got under Trump's skin. But what's really driving Trump's latest push against Ukraine? It all comes down to resources. From Trump's perspective, Ukraine has been taking advantage of the US since the war began, receiving free military and financial aid. He's even thrown around exaggerated numbers, claiming the US has given $350 billion, while European countries only contributed $100 billion. The real number, about $183 billion in total, with $65 billion of that going to military aid, much of which benefits the US defense industry. But Trump believes it's time for Kyiv to start giving something back. The US has now pushed for Ukraine to hand over half of its rare earth minerals, a deal Trump values at $500 billion. It's a bold and aggressive move to secure strategic resources from a country already struggling with the war. Waltz even called it a historic opportunity for Ukraine to expand its resource market with US investments. He pointed to an old, broken-down smelter, saying that if it were repaired, it could cover all of America's aluminum imports for an entire year. Trump took Zelensky's refusal as a direct insult. While flying back to Washington from Mar-a-Lago on February 19th, he revisited the situation, claiming that Besant was treated disrespectfully because he was flat-out told no. He also alleged that Zelensky was asleep and unavailable for a meeting, though that was clearly false. There's even a photo capturing their handshake. Trump also insisted that taking the train from Warsaw was risky, despite the fact that Joe Biden had made the same trip before. To really understand Trump's approach, it helps to look at his 1987 book, The Art of the Deal. In it, he explains his strategy, saying that his deal-making style is simple. He sets high demands and then keeps pushing pushing until he gets what he wants. He admits that sometimes he has to settle for less, but in most cases, he still comes out on top. That's exactly what's happening here. Even though Kyiv has already rejected the rare earth minerals deal, Trump isn't backing down. He's making it a requirement for any future military aid while continuing to challenge Zelensky's leadership in ways that align with Moscow's stance. He's even calling for elections in Ukraine and pushing for an investigation into whether any US aid money has been misused. Meanwhile, President Macron made it clear he planned to have a word with Trump. He wanted to remind him that both the US and Europe have a shared interest in standing firm against Putin, especially during US-led negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Macron also hinted at a bigger picture. He suggested that the way Trump handles Putin could have serious consequences for America's relationship with China, which is the US's biggest economic and military rival. This was diplomacy in full swing, live and unfiltered. Macron played his part, but Trump stole the spotlight with the best lines. He didn't hold back, warning that the Ukraine conflict could escalate into a nuclear war if a resolution wasn't reached. Macron, on the other hand, pledged to send troops to support any peace deal, but ended up highlighting Europe's vulnerabilities when he practically begged for US security guarantees to lock in that agreement. Trump wasn't having it. He shut the idea down immediately, saying Europe must take that central role and assure the long-term security of Ukraine. Basically, that meant European boots on the ground as a form of assurance. But let's be real, how credible is that force when, at this point, only France, Britain, and Sweden have even shown interest in participating? Macron hasn't exactly been in a position of strength lately. His decision to call for National Assembly elections backfired, leaving him without a parliamentary majority. Things have been so tense that when he showed up at the annual agriculture show in Paris, he had to be kept far away from furious farmers. Even his public walkabouts are now limited to pre-screened crowds. And on the international stage, Algeria has straight up embarrassed him, refusing to take back its citizens who are under deportation orders. Their relationship has deteriorated so much, it's basically a Cold War at this point. Back in the day, Macron could go to Washington expecting to have his voice heard, but this time, he was just a supporting actor in Trump's all-day photo op. And now, it's going to be Keir Starmer's turn. Soon, he'll step into the spotlight, but let's be honest, his attempt to recalibrate Trump's stance on Ukraine doesn't seem like it'll get very far. Starmer has been pushing for tougher sanctions on Russia, while Trump is eyeing massive trade deals with them. And when it comes to tariffs, Trump probably won't be any more moved by Starmer's arguments. In fact, Starmer might even find himself on the defensive after J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he called out Britain for cracking down on free speech. No doubt Downing Street will try to put a positive spin on the meeting. But let's be real, it's Trump, not Starmer, who's going to set the tone. As for now, we clearly saw Trump's frustrations weren't just limited to Zelensky. His tensions with world leaders extended to the G7 video meeting, where things took an awkward turn with French President Emmanuel Macron. So, what exactly did Macron do after interrupting Trump? Emmanuel Macron interrupts Trump. During a conversation, Trump stated that Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine and is getting their money back. Macron quickly interrupted, grabbing Trump's hand and responding, "No, in fact. To be frank, we paid. We paid 60% of the total effort." That moment was caught on video and spread like wildfire across social media. Some people applauded Emmanuel Macron for fact-checking Trump, while others felt he was being impolite to his host. French President Emmanuel Macron made it clear that the $300 billion in Russian assets, mostly held in Europe, couldn't just be taken because that would go against international law. Meanwhile, Trump reacted to a correction about the war effort, saying, "If you believe that, it's okay with me. But they get their money back, we don't, and now we do," referring to the agreement on mining resources that he claimed was being finalized with Kyiv. As Trump pushed hard to bring an end to what he called this bloody conflict as soon as possible, Macron laid out his own plan, which had two stages. First, a ceasefire with strict conditions, meaning Russia would have to commit to stopping attacks on key infrastructure and cities. Then, a long-term peace deal covering everything from territorial issues to security guarantees and rebuilding Ukraine. Macron emphasized, "We want peace," saying he was speaking on behalf of Europe. This peace must not be a surrender of Ukraine. It must not mean a ceasefire without guarantees. And this peace must ensure the conditions of Ukrainian sovereignty. But while Macron was stressing security and commitments, Trump seemed focused on one thing: getting peace and getting it fast. The French president also kept bringing up how important it was for the US to stay committed to security, especially since European countries were prepared to step up their efforts. Macron pointed out, "We've experienced peace accords that were only ceasefires without ensuring security guarantees, Minsk 1 and 2, and we want to make sure this doesn't happen again." He was referring to negotiations in 2014 and 2015, led by France and Germany, that ultimately failed to prevent Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And he didn't hesitate to lecture Trump, who had already made it clear he planned to limit US involvement if he returned to the White House. Macron warned, "I think we should never say, 'I will never send boots on the ground,' because you give a blank check to violate any type of commitment." Trump, while keeping things vague, did express support for the security backup that European countries want from the US as they consider deploying troops in Ukraine to help enforce a peace deal. But he seemed to downplay the whole thing. France and the UK are already working on peaceful deployments of troops, not for combat. Standing next to Macron, Trump claimed that Vladimir Putin would accept this European deployment since, according to him, Putin had already asked for it. He dismissed concerns about possible escalation, saying, "I think that's not going to be a problem. Once an agreement is signed, Russia is going to get back to its business, and Ukraine and Europe are going to get back to their business." Basically, he didn't see the security backup as a big deal. In what seemed like an attempt to nudge Trump toward compromises that might favor Europe, Macron publicly acted like the shift in US foreign policy wasn't a huge deal, but Trump himself was pretty blunt about it. He said, "My administration is making a decisive break with the foreign policy values of the past administration and, frankly, the past." Trump never really talked about shared values, European security, or transatlantic alliances. Instead, his priorities seem to boil down to three things: locking in an economic deal with Ukraine centered on mining resources, securing a ceasefire to stop the bloodbath without putting the blame on Putin, and getting Europe to take on more of the financial and military responsibility for its own security. According to the French delegation, Trump didn't mention pulling US troops out of Europe. Currently, around 100,000 are stationed there, or even significantly reducing their presence. The G7 leaders couldn't agree on a joint statement because the US refused to label Russia as the aggressor. Meanwhile, as Macron was at the White House, the US made its shift in global policy even clearer, with a vote at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Kyiv and a bunch of European countries pushed for a statement calling Russia the aggressor and demanding they pull their troops out. But Washington wasn't on board with that. The US actually ended up siding with a small group of just 18 countries, including Belarus, North Korea, Sudan, and Hungary, while China chose to sit this one out. Even with the opposition, the resolution still passed with the support of 93 members. Now, here's where things get interesting. The US being this isolated when it comes to Ukraine, that's pretty rare, but if you've been following global politics, you might remember a similar pattern when it comes to the Gaza Strip. The Biden administration has consistently used its veto power to block resolutions that criticize Israel. But then, right after that, the US put forward its own draft resolution, which, according to its delegation, was elegant in its simplicity. This one actually got through the Security Council with support from both Russia and China. But here's the catch. The resolution was super vague. It just expressed sadness over the loss of life in Ukraine, making it sound like some kind of natural disaster rather than a war. 5 European countries weren't convinced and decided to abstain. In the end, the resolution was approved with 10 votes and 0 opposition. This whole back and forth was a pretty big moment for transatlantic relations. The idea that these countries share the same values, that's looking shaky. And even the idea that they have common interests is now under serious question. 3 years of war, and now a critical bridge on the verge of collapse. Ukraine's situation as the US shifts from Biden to Trump can be summed up pretty simply, going from full-on support to the risk of being left hanging, from empathy to indifference, from customized aid to straight-up pressure. The new president is pushing hard for peace, but for Ukraine, that comes with serious risks. They can't afford to lose Washington's backing, and if this so-called Pax Americana is basically just a deal made with Moscow while ignoring what Ukraine has been through, that would be a massive blow. On top of everything they've already sacrificed to protect their land and independence, which has been under attack since Crimea was taken in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 2022. For 3 years, the US has been in Ukraine's corner. At first, Washington was caught off guard by Ukraine's resilience and the struggles of the Russian military. But once it became clear that Ukraine wasn't going down without a fight, Joe Biden worked to rally support for President Volodymyr Zelensky and his people. That being said, Biden, who built his political mindset during the Cold War, always had had a red line, avoiding any scenario where the war could spiral into a showdown between nuclear-armed superpowers. From the start, America's approach was both proactive and out of the ordinary. As early as November 2021, after CIA Director William Burns visited Moscow, Washington made the call to declassify intelligence on Russian troop movements near Ukraine's border. The US wasn't buying the idea that these were just military exercises, and the White House openly called out the Kremlin's intentions. So when the invasion began, nobody in the West could really claim to be shocked. At first, many expected Kiev to fall quickly, Russian tanks rolling in, Zelensky fleeing, but that didn't happen. Ukraine held its ground. The response from the West came fast, with waves of economic sanctions and the first shipments of weapons. Dara Massikot, an expert at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, explained that during this first phase, the US focused on delivering whatever could be sent the fastest, which included assault rifles, anti-tank weapons, and artillery shells. But now, things are not looking good for Ukraine when it comes to the US backing them, and the Trump-Macron meeting didn't exactly clear things up either. Although there were some tensions, Macron didn't hold back when it came to pushing back against Trump on big topics like the Ukraine war and trade policy. He also tackled the hot-button issue of trade between the US and the European Union, something Trump has been threatening with massive tariffs. Macron made it clear that he wanted fair competition that encouraged more investment. Macron said, "We want to have more prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic. We have a shared agenda in that regard." During a Fox News interview, Macron doubled down on his stance that the US should work with Europe economically instead of stirring up tension. He pointed out that the US cannot have a trade war with China and Europe at the same time. Meanwhile, British broadcaster Piers Morgan, who's been friends with Trump for years, praised Macron for his approach. Morgan wrote in a post on X, "No world leader handles Trump as well as Macron. Friendly but firm, respectful but not afraid to stand up to him when he thinks he's wrong, and Trump respects him for it." Well, Trump and Macron have generally had a good relationship dating back to 2017. Trump and Macron relationship. Trump and Macron first met in 2017 at the NATO summit in Brussels. At the time, Trump was fresh off his presidential campaign, where he had been vocal about his skepticism toward NATO, calling it outdated and accusing European allies of taking advantage of the US. This set the stage for what would become a series of fascinating interactions between the two leaders, starting with a handshake that immediately caught people's attention. Those who witnessed their first handshake described it as unusually intense. Both leaders gripped each other's hands so tightly that their knuckles turned white, neither willing to let go first. They kept their jaws clenched the entire time, with tight, forced smiles that barely masked the underlying tension. It was clear this was more than just a polite greeting, it was a power play. Macron later admitted that he had done this on purpose, explaining that while a handshake wasn't the defining factor in diplomacy, it was still a symbolic moment that revealed a lot about the dynamics between them. A few months later, Trump visited France for Bastille Day, and yet again, their handshake became a spectacle. This time, it lasted nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in handshake terms. While the interaction appeared friendlier than their first meeting, it was still firm and assertive. At one point, Trump even managed to shake hands with both Macron and France's First Lady, Brigitte Macron, simultaneously, turning what was already an unusual moment into something even more theatrical. The following week, Trump spoke positively about Macron, calling him intelligent and strong, and even joked about how much Macron seemed to enjoy their handshakes. By 2018, the pattern of firm and lengthy handshakes continued. In April, during Macron's state visit to Washington, D.C., the two leaders shared yet another handshake, this time lasting about 6 seconds, before it turned into a somewhat awkward side hug. But what really caught people's attention was Trump casually brushing dust off Macron's shoulder during the visit. Body language experts analyzed the move, with one specialist pointing out that when two people interact, the first person to make physical contact often asserts dominance. By brushing Macron's shoulder, Trump was subtly positioning himself as the more powerful figure in the exchange. 2 months later, the two leaders faced off again at the G7 summit in Canada, and this time, Macron seemed determined to make a statement of his own. As they shook hands, he squeezed so tightly that a visible thumbprint was left on Trump's hand. The moment was widely interpreted as Macron flipping the script and showing his own strength in their ongoing display of political posturing. By 2019, tensions between Trump and Macron had become more pronounced, and their handshakes reflected that shift. At the NATO summit in London, the two leaders found themselves at odds over the alliance's role, with Macron going as far as to describe NATO as being in a state of decline, partially due to American disengagement. Unlike their previous dramatic greetings, this time their handshake was more restrained, mirroring the growing divide between them. Last December, Trump, Macron, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met in Paris ahead of the highly anticipated reopening of the Notre Dame Cathedral. This was Trump's first foreign trip as president-elect, and yet again, his interaction with Macron became a topic of discussion. As Trump stepped out of his vehicle, he firmly pulled Macron's hand toward him in an assertive grip. Later, during a second handshake, witnesses observed that Trump positioned his hand above Macron's and pressed down firmly as they locked hands once again. The two also exchanged whispered words during the meeting, a moment that fueled speculation about what exactly was being discussed between them. Over the years, the interactions between Trump and Macron became a fascinating display of political and personal dynamics. Whether intentional or not, their handshakes were far more than simple greetings. They became a symbol of the power struggle and shifting relationship between two world leaders, played out for the entire world to see. Their relationship cooled off while Trump was out of office, but Macron wasted no time after getting re-elected in November 2024. Now Macron became the first European leader to visit since Trump kicked off his second term. Trump gave Macron a friendly tap on the upper arm and said, "He's a smart customer." He was sharing a story about a meeting in Paris where he realized that what Macron had been saying in French about a trade deal didn't quite match what he had told him directly. Macron switched to French, and Trump, clearly not a fan of being left out, cut in with a compliment. "That is the most beautiful language," capping it off with a firm thigh pat. Macron, unfazed, responded by casually placing his hand on top of Trump's. Macron took it in stride, gripping Trump's hand as they both laughed. At one point, the French leader even looked like he wiped away a tear from laughing so hard. As they headed into the West Wing, they shared an embrace, and of course another one of those firm, almost crushing handshakes. Later, during their joint press conference, after delivering their opening statements, they took a moment to shake hands again, smiling for the cameras and throwing compliments at each other. Macron praised their friendship from your first term, while Trump went on about how impressed he was with the restoration of the Notre Dame Cathedral after the fire. And before wrapping up, Trump made sure to say hello to your beautiful wife. Now, diplomacy always comes with a bit of symbolism, but these two, they've taken body language to another level. Ever since they first met, Macron has seemed determined to push back against Trump's habit of overpowering handshakes, the kind that can throw world leaders off, both physically and figuratively. Both parties want to end the Russia-Ukraine war, however. Both have a different approach. The meeting between Trump and Macron really showed how differently they see Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Trump has been trying to mend fences with Putin and is hoping to meet him soon. At one point, a reporter asked Trump if he considered Putin a dictator, especially since he had called Ukraine's Zelensky that last week. Trump kept it vague, saying, "I don't use those words lightly. I think that we're going to see how it all works out. Let's see what happens." Macron, though, was way more direct. He called Russia the aggressor in the war and made it clear that Putin violated the peace. Meanwhile, Trump had recently accused Ukraine of starting the war. Macron did push Trump to make sure any peace deal was fair to Ukraine, but he also acknowledged Trump's long-standing complaint that the US has been carrying too much of Europe's security burden, especially when it comes to Ukraine. Macron admitted that European countries need to do more to more fairly share the security burden that your country has been carrying for so many years. One area where the two leaders found common ground was the idea of a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine as part of a possible settlement. Trump stated that Putin would also be open to this condition. Meanwhile, Trump has been putting pressure on Ukraine to hand over control of its rare mineral reserves, valued in the hundreds of billions of dollars, as a way to recoup US aid. So far, Zelensky has resisted agreeing to such a deal. Speaking alongside Macron, Trump stated that negotiations were getting very close to finalization and insisted that the US would eventually recover its money through this agreement. Macron appeared to offer cautious approval, suggesting that Trump was likely to sign a rare earth minerals deal soon and expressing France's satisfaction with strong American involvement in the matter. Not everyone, however, saw this deal as fair. Anatol Lieven, director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, described the US demand for Ukraine's rare minerals as predatory. He argued that Trump was asking for significantly more than what the US had given and pointed out that the assistance provided was never intended as a loan, but rather as a strategic investment in America's own security. He considered this approach completely illegitimate, but noted that a more balanced agreement might still be possible. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Alright, that's a wrap for this video, but don't go just yet. Click any of the cards popping up on your screen and keep watching.